Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. As you can see, I'm off screen, and I wouldn't do that for any other group other than a group of people who understand care and caregiving. So uh, consider yourself in a small and very esteemed group of people in my mind. Today, we are so happy to be co hosting this event with Jess Calarco and New America. We are a group called the Care Force. And again, my name is Eve Rodsky. I'm a member of the Care Force as an author of a book called Fair Play, which examines the role of men in stepping into their full power in the home so that women can step out into their full power in the world. Rebecca Gale is going to be hosting an amazing conversation with our guest today, Jessica Calarco, professor and author of the book Holding It Together, How Women Became America's Social Safety Net, which is not where we want to be. And so today, I think, will be the path forward for undoing all of that damage that Jessica so beautifully writes about in her book. So I want to hand it over to Rebecca. And again, if you are out there and you want to be part of our advocacy group called Care Force, it is a place for you if you are a researcher, an advocate, a storyteller who has devoted their lives to something, any topic related to the care of another human being. We would love to have you. And so here I will turn it over to Rebecca, and very, very, very excited for this conversation today.
Eve, thank you so much. I have to say how honored I am to sort of be sandwiched in between these two amazing authors who have really tackled these issues that are facing women and families across the board. I'm Rebecca Gale. I'm a staff writer with the Better Life Lab at New America, where I cover issues like workplace and childcare, and I work with some amazing people. And this part of this great work involves talking to writers and professors and researchers like Jessica Calarco about their work. So if anyone has not read this book, I highly recommend that there is a place to purchase it. But to sort of summarize it, that when I picked this book up, I knew that Jessica Calarco was onto something right away, because there is a reason that the women in this country feel so much pressure rests on their shoulders, that parenting is very hard. We have many expectations. They're heaped onto us, and we sort of feel like we have to hold it all together with pluck, grit, duct tape, super glue, and if not, the world's going to fall apart. Maybe not that exactly, certainly not the super glue piece, but there are unrealistic expectations for the way we parent in this country. And part of that comes from the United States' lack of a social safety net. And Jess made headlines several years ago in November 2020 with her quote about why so many women were feeling so stressed, when she said, "Other countries have social safety nets, the US has women." And that went viral, and it kicked off, I think Jess was already doing this research, but it kicked off what really became the thesis of our book. So my first question to you, Jess, is to talk about that. Your book sounds like it was written with COVID entirely in mind. And my understanding is your research went back way before that. So tell me a bit about your process and how you got there. And thank you again.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, first, thank you so much for hosting this event. Thanks to Eve for introducing us, and thanks to Rebecca for this conversation, and to New America and Better Life Lab and Care Force, and to all of you for being here today. This book is not the book that I intended to write with these data. And that, to Rebecca's point, I initially envisioned this project to be looking at what I thought of at the time as the best laid plans of parenting. So I had my own two kids in 2014 and 2017. My earlier research was mostly ethnographic in nature. I spent a lot of time doing observations in schools and communities, talking to families and kids and teachers about inequalities in the classroom. But I knew I wasn't in a life place, in part because of my own childcare challenges, to be able to do another big ethnography. And I was thinking a lot about parenting and the way that things, the sort of the way that life intervenes in our decision making around parenting, to push us off course, and kind of how do families grapple with that. And so that's really where I started question-wise with this book, and started by recruiting 250 pregnant people from prenatal clinics in Indiana, and they all identified as women, so I talk about them that way. And
Wait,
what
this
we
is
did
what
was,
year when you first
so
started?
this was we started in 2018. So between
Okay.
2018 and 2019, we were recruiting pregnant people from prenatal clinics. And then the plan was to follow up with those women roughly every 6 months after that, to check in at 6 months and 12 months and 18 months postpartum to see, okay, so, you told us all the decisions that you planned to make. How did this actually play out in terms of, their decision making with their young kids? And about half had older kids as well, and half were first-time moms. And the pandemic hit, maybe as all, if you do the math, it's kind of obvious, hit in the middle of our data collection for this project. And so it became kind of painfully obvious very quickly in that process of how much of an impact the pandemic was having on families with young children, and particularly on the women within those families who, in many of the couples that we've been following, they never even talked about who would be the one to fill in the gaps of childcare when schools and childcare centers shut down. And it was not only moms doing that work by default, but also being the ones who figured out, who made sure that grandma got her medication, who made sure that neighbors got food when they got COVID and needed things delivered, who filled in the gaps in the paid workforce when they had colleagues who were ill or dealing with care crises or dealing with staffing shortages on those fronts. And so women were sort of stretched in all of these directions. And that for me, led to these questions about, how did we get here? How did we get to this point where we could respond to a crisis by having women be this sort of invisible glue that holds us all together, rather than trying to, actually build the kind of, support structures that we need, and have the kind of system where everyone could more equitably chip in to maintain this sort of, collective well-being. And there was a moment when I was writing the book when I thought this might be a hopeful story, when we had sort of Build Back Better on the horizon, when we had some of these pandemic programs put in place. And so I thought this might sort of be a success story. But then, as we're all well aware, Build Back Better fell apart. And not only did we go in that direction, but we've also further dismantled the social safety net that we had before the pandemic. We've attacked reproductive rights. We've attacked, many of the kinds of freedoms that we have in this country. And so I think that, for me, only made it feel more imperative to try to tell this story of not only how did we get here, but where do we go from here, and how do we have a chance, and what could it look like to potentially try to build back better, to fight collectively for the kind of social safety net that we need and deserve.
Yeah, I think your book really nails on it. And it's interesting that you were really able to bifurcate that COVID period with some sort of before and during and really after. And I think sort of the ethnographic way you presented that is really fascinating. And COVID is still very recent for us not to have that many other examples of it. One thing I also want to add to the audience is we have something called a Slido chat box where if you have questions for Jess, you're welcome to put them in and we will take them at the end as well. But maybe I can incorporate them as people bring them in. Something else your book talks about that I think we spent a lot of time talking about at the Better Life Lab is this DIY model of United States individualism, that like you are a self-made person, you are an individual family, you do not need social safety nets. You really have to maintain this illusion of being a DIY society, when we know, and research shows us over and over again, that we do need these supports, either community supports or social supports or larger family supports. So my question for you is, where do you think this illusion came from, and why do you think it's been maintained for so long, and at what cost?
Yeah, so I kind of trace in the book the origins of this kind of DIY individualistic model of society back to the 1930s, and to the wake of the Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal following the Great Depression. At the time, I mean, so the New Deal programs put in place not only things like Social Security, but also things like mothers' pensions, which laid the groundwork for the welfare systems as we know them today. And so essentially, in the wake of these policies, they required higher levels of taxes and regulations, especially on wealthy people and corporations. And, those big business elites at the time weren't super happy with these higher taxes that they had to pay. And so drawing on work by Naomi Oreskes and Timothy Conway, or Eric Conway, showing how this essentially led folks like the National Association of Manufacturers to look for ideologies that could help to persuade Americans that we don't actually need a social safety net. And what they found was neoliberalism, essentially an economic theory that was being developed at the time by a group of Austrian economists who were arguing that societies don't actually need social safety nets and are actually better off without them, because without that kind of protection, people will, at least in theory, kind of make the kinds of good choices that will supposedly keep them safe from risk. And so, these wealthy business owners and their kind of allies paid to import those Austrian economists and give them endowed professorships at, elite universities in the US, where they went on to train the next generation of American economists, folks like, Milton Friedman, who went on to play a key role in shaping US social policy and also in helping to orchestrate massive propaganda campaigns. Things like the General Electric Theater, which was a popular television program that ran for decades and was hosted by Ronald Reagan before he was Ronald Reagan, to persuade Americans that we don't actually need this social safety net, that we can sort of pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. And, the reality is that this kind of DIY model, it's been sold to us for generations now, but it doesn't actually leave us better off. It's leaving families and communities in this deeply precarious position. But we've managed in the US, and part of the reason why this ideology, I argue, has been able to remain so sticky is that we've managed to kind of maintain this DIY illusion by pushing the work of the social safety net onto women to manage instead. That we have women not only doing, the bulk of the unpaid caregiving labor, filling in the gaps in our childcare system, in our healthcare system, in our elder care systems, but also being pushed to fill the gaps in our economy that are created by this kind of DIY model too, the kinds of paid jobs that, disproportionately don't work well with a kind of profit-driven market economy. Things like, childcare, things like home health care, jobs that are deeply essential, but that are too labor intensive to be both highly profitable and highly accessible to the people who need them. And so there's an interest in this kind of a model and in pushing that work onto women to make it seem as though we don't actually need to fund those services the way that many other countries do as part of the social safety net.
I mean, that is a really interesting thing, the way you've traced it back to how it's been sold to us, because to me, it sounds very obvious that wouldn't be the case, but when you go back 100 years, people being told this is how Americans live, it's a really hard thing to sort of undo. You have an entire chapter in your book called Good Choices Won't Save Us. And that's one of my favorite. And it really ties into the neoliberalism that you mentioned here. So this idea is that people made the right choices that you talk about. If they never went into the water, they would never need a life jacket. If they never had a baby, they would never had a complicated childbirth. Like if we all made the right choices, then we'd actually have no need for a social safety net.
That's essentially the logic. And certainly, that logic has been thoroughly debunked. It doesn't really work that way. This is not how people respond in the context of high levels of risk. But it's an alluring idea, in part because we can look to the correlation between things like the people who make good choices tend to have, better economic outcomes, better life outcomes in our society. But what that ignores is the fact that, correlation is not causation, as any good social scientist knows. And in the sense that, the people who are able to make those quote unquote good choices, the people who are able to go to college and finish a degree, the people who are able to delay parenthood or, wait for exactly the right moment, even the people who are able to get married or the people who are able to, live in the right part of the country, it takes privilege to make those good choices. And so really, when we're kind of measuring that correlation between good choices and good outcomes, what we're often measuring instead is the level of privilege that people have. And so, I think it's this alluring idea, and it's sold in part through, a massive self-help industry that helps to kind of perpetuate this idea that, if people just make the right choices, then if they just find the right partner, if they just choose the right college major, go to choose the right job, that all those choices in the, regardless of what level of privilege they have, will lead to better outcomes, despite some substantial evidence to the contrary.
So when you mentioned Build Back Better earlier, which as many of us know was this massive opportunity to fund a lot of these social safety net programs at unprecedented levels after the COVID era funding had shown such promise, and how close it came to passing and then not. Do you see these DIY, these good choices concept, the neoliberalism as being the reason this was defeated?
I think we can trace it there. I think we can kind of take it a step further and see, what did that DIY model help to promote? And there I draw on Jacob Happer's work with the Great Risk Shift. And essentially what he argues in his book by the same name is that we saw, and then kind of starting in the 1960s and 70s, this sort of our policies in the US really began to embody this neoliberal idea in the sense of cutting taxes, cutting regulations. And particularly, I think what matters here for the context of Build Back Better is the deregulation of things like campaign spending, and the way that we've not only allowed a substantial increase in the level of wealth that is held in the hands of a very small number of people by, dramatically cutting taxes on ultra wealthy people and corporations, for example, but also making it much easier for that very small kind of group of people at the very top of the economic ladder to use that money to influence politics in ways that can prevent us from getting the kinds of policies that the vast majority of Americans support. I mean, that was very much the case with Build Back Better, where it seemed like we were very close to passing it until we had, Kirsten Sinema and Joe Manchin kind of getting in the way. And what the data show on that front is that they were funded to do so by the same billionaire Republican donors who funded Donald Trump's campaign and who funded the Republicans who voted against it as well. And so I think we really do have to think about how this sort of concentration of wealth in the hands of a very small group of people in the context of this risk shift, coupled with the deregulation of campaign spending, has really helped to fuel this system where the voice of the people doesn't matter much anymore.
We did a number of stories at the time on, for Joe Manchin specifically, on the people in West Virginia who had stood just make tremendous benefit from the Build Back Better provisions. I'm sure in Arizona as well, but you could really see that. And it was such an interesting disconnect to see that the politicians were voting against the interests of people in their state.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, and certainly I think we can think about how people themselves, I talk in the book about cases of people who would have benefited from these policies individually, but who end up, who are willing to vote against them or willing to vote, for the politicians who are opposed to these kinds of policies, in part because not having a social safety net allows them to maintain a sort of sense of moral superiority over people who are a little bit worse off or a little bit lower down on the socioeconomic ladder than they are. I tell the story of a mom that I call April, who's a white evangelical Christian mom who, she's a stay-at-home mom who gets by on a $30,000 salary from her husband's job as a pastor at their church, and would benefit tremendously from these stronger social safety net programs, but opposes universal health care, opposes universal child care, opposes even raising the minimum wage beyond the $7.25 an hour it is in Indiana where she lives. And really kind of digging into where this comes from, she buys in very heavily to this idea of meritocracy, to this idea that hard work alone and good choices should be able to save people. And she used that logic, that rhetoric to kind of judge other women, particularly lower income women than herself, to say, if they need that stimulus money, if they need these programs, they must be making poor financial choices. She said things like they must be going and getting their nails done, they must be going to the spa, they must be going out partying, drawing on some rhetoric and stereotypes in making those kinds of claims. And at the same time, that allowed her to feel better about herself, even as she was, cutting off her nose to spite her face to some extent in terms of her ability to benefit from those programs herself.
Well, I remember April from your book very clearly because you sort of talk about that surprise and how much she would benefit and how much she's struggling. But it ties into something else you talk about, which is the super mom myth, where that moms like April are there to prevent their children from making these poor choices and heading down into ruin. So can you talk a bit about how you uncovered this and what you found?
Yeah, and so essentially, we did interviews with moms about the kinds of challenges that they were facing. We also did a whole host of survey questions, kind of gave them standard kinds of meritocracy questions, standard kinds of gender attitude questions, and some of these questions were around things like, do you believe that kids are better off if they have a mom who's at home with full time, or is it just as well if is it just as well for kids if moms are working for pay? And what we found on that front was that substantial numbers of women were buying into this idea, like, over 40% of women, mothers in the US, so we also did, in addition to our national surveys of two surveys of about 2,000 parents from across the US to see, how is this playing out in the US as a whole. And more than 40% of the moms in those surveys said, it's actually better for kids if moms are staying home full time. And what I find is that through the interviews that we did, that a lot of that sort of perception that childcare is only a benefit for mothers, that it's not a benefit for kids, that if anything, it's detrimental for kids, really stems back to a lot of the fear mongering that happened around childcare, particularly in the context of the what I talk about as sort of the satanic panic that happened in the US in the 1980s and 90s, where there were a couple of cases of kind of high profile, vastly overblown accusations against childcare providers that really captured the national attention, and in part through the work of conservative pundits, conservative policymakers who use these to push back against rising rates of maternal employment and to make these claims about how childcare isn't safe for children, and that really this is, you have to be selfish to put your to put your children in childcare if you're able to stay home financially. And those kinds of ideas, many of the mothers that we talk to, even if they'd never personally experienced any sort of problem with childcare, even if they didn't even personally know anyone who'd had a bad experience with childcare, had this perception that childcare wasn't safe for children, that childcare, wasn't something that was good for kids overall, despite considerable evidence to the contrary, that this is, early socialization is great for kids. It's great for, families' well-being and mental health, and allows us to have stronger relationships with our kids in the time that we do spend with them. But it creates the perception that mothers have to be kind of, even if they are working for pay, hyper vigilant in kind of keeping an eye out for those kinds of potential risks to children. And this gets to this idea of the supermom myth, which is this notion that, only mothers, only women are able to be the sort of natural best protectors for children. And what that does is that it means that we're susceptible to fear mongering. We're susceptible to those kinds of overblown, often threats about potential risks to children, things like fear mongering around childcare. And also, we can see that echoes of that same fear mongering with things like the CRT panic, the panic around critical race theory, the panic around transgender kids, that this is fear mongering that is intended to treat particularly, parents in general, but especially mothers, as having to, step in to protect their children from those kinds of perceived harms. And this can lead women to feel like they have to sacrifice themselves, either that dropping out of the workforce or cutting back their work hours or trying to do it all simultaneously, because they perceive these threats to their kids that they've been kind of pushed into fearing, despite, possibly some evidence to the contrary. We see this with things like, the kind of hypervigilance around kids' physical safety, kind of concerns around allowing kids to be sort of free range in our society, that there's a lot of ways that this manifests that leads mothers to, even if they could potentially choose to make different choices or to support a stronger social safety net, that they might be hesitant to do so because of those kinds of fears.
Well, I want to hit a point you said about that only the mothers are the ones to take care of it. And if mothers need care or want care, it's a very selfish option for them, and how negative that stuff that can be internalized for people. But also the framework you discuss in the book is that women are unable to say no more than men. They may have opportunities to set up sort of boundaries, and they feel more obligated to sort of opt into some of this caregiving work, even to their own detriment. And I think you gave an example of a woman, I think it was Patricia, the name you call her, and she is like, just had a baby, she's exhausted, and she's still driving her mom and her neighbor around because they don't have a car. The idea being that she knows that she's going to need their help down the road. So can we talk a bit about how that paradox exists and what you found or what your takeaway is?
Yeah, so essentially on that front, what I find is that the exploitation of women that we use in this country to maintain this DIY illusion, the burden of that falls disproportionately to particularly low-income women and disproportionately to women of color, in part because the way that we have systematically underinvested in their communities and in their families, the way that we've set them up to fail, makes it difficult for them. They not only have almost nowhere to turn for support because of how little there is to go around in their communities, but also nowhere to hide when other people turn to them to ask for support as well. And that, as you mentioned with Patricia, can make it difficult for them to say no, to step away, even when they need more time for themselves. And in Patricia's case, she was, before the pandemic, she was married and she had 3 kids, 2 in elementary school and one who was a sort of toddler age. And she was in a low-income household. She was working a full-time but very low-wage job as a customer service rep. And her husband was working, they're a Black family, and he was working full-time as a construction laborer. And she had taken this job as a customer service rep because it was the best job she could find that would allow her to work remotely, even before COVID. And this was, what that meant, though, was that when the pandemic hit, she became, the default caregiver. She was one of those couples that never even talked about who would do this work in the context of the pandemic. And, but this took a huge toll on Patricia in the sense that she's trying to do her work from home job. She's also trying to take care of 2 kids who are, remote learning. and take care of a toddler at the same time. And she talked about the guilt that she felt in the context of those pressures, and how, she talked about how like she needs to remind herself not to kind of clock out as a mother mentally at the end of the day. And at the same time, so she decides in the context of this, she's like, I'm going to go from working 5 days a week to working 4 because I need more time. I'm exhausted. And she'd also recently unexpectedly become pregnant with twins. And so she's just physically exhausted, and she's trying to deal with her kids at home and this paid work. But what ends up happening is that with that extra day off every week, her extended family finds out, and they start asking her to use that day off to help drive them around to the grocery store, to the doctor. Because she lives in a low income or a working class Black community where a lot of folks, including many people in her family, don't have reliable vehicles. And so she knows that, especially during the context of the pandemic, the other option is to put them on the bus. And so that increases not only the time that they have to waste, navigating their daily lives, but also the COVID risk at the time. And so she felt like, even if she wanted to say no, she felt like she couldn't say no, both because she knew they had nowhere else to turn, and because she worried that if she did say no, that she might need help later someday. And unfortunately, that is what ended up happening. So she and her husband ended up divorcing just before the twins were born. This was, I think the COVID was just sort of the last straw for them. They'd separated a couple of times before that. And it was, she was frustrated that he wasn't doing more to help her, and wasn't in a position to, in part because he was working outside the home and she was working remotely. And at the same time, this created a huge challenge for her in that she had a C-section with the twins, and she needed someone to drive her around to doctor's appointments, and, couldn't drive herself for a couple of weeks. And so this was, a place where she then had to turn back to those same people in her community and say, hey, look, I need your help now. And she felt, grateful on the one hand that she hadn't turned them away before, but at the same time also felt like it wasn't enough. And she talked about the sort of the deep depression that she fell into after the twins were born, in part because it was, she just felt like it was so much that it was just kind of having to do this all on her own and not having the support. Even with the support that she got, it just didn't feel like enough to be able to manage, and let alone try to take care of herself in the process.
I mean, that sounds daunting for anyone, particularly anybody who would be low resource in any sense of it, the word. But yes, I think that was a really powerful example that you had given. One thing I want to also bring up with some time was you had a chapter that seemed a little different, but it was really fascinating, about the sexism jokes and how men, not all men, some men can sort of use humor as a way to perpetuate misogynistic attitudes. And then they do it and they say, oh, well, it's a joke. It's a joke. I didn't mean it. And other men are saying, well, that's silly, but I don't really believe that, but I believe it a little bit. So can you talk about, first of all, I'd be curious to hear also like how you got to this chapter, like how you added that piece in. That was designed to be sort of like why these myths are so pervasive, or if it was something that you found along the way and what you found.
Yeah, so this chapter came out of, so in addition to interviewing those moms that we started off with back in 2018, during the pandemic, we did 3 more waves of data collection, both with the original moms and also with as many of the partners of those moms as were willing to talk to us. And those partner interviews, particularly interviews with dads, they often, whenever they had kind of unequal divisions of labor in ways that favored, men, when men were doing a disproportionate share of the paid work and doing a disproportionately low share of the caregiving labor, they often couched it in humor. The way that they talked about it, they would sort of joke about, oh, we're not one of those 1950s families, but kind of thing, in terms of the way that they would present this. And so this to me, got me interested in trying to think about what is the role that humor is playing here, and kind of went down a rabbit hole of digging into the research on humor, the research on the role of humor, the relationship between humor and sexism. And the data there is really, both fascinating and troubling in terms of showing that this kind of, when there's experimental research showing that when sexism is couched in humor, it's actually more, it's stickier in the sense that men who are exposed to it are more likely to kind of buy into those kinds of underlying sexist ideas when it's presented to them in humorous form. And it also operates as a sort of gaslighting tool, in that when women are exposed to, essentially like either harassing or sort of, gender unequal types of messaging, when it's couched as humor, they're less likely to push back and complain, in part because they worry about being, sort of called out for being too uptight, for not being able to take a joke. And so, humor to me, I think it suggests that it plays this role in allowing men to buy into the kinds of sexist ideologies that are, psychologically useful for men in the context of our deeply unequal system. And I think that's a key piece too. One of the questions that I wanted to answer was, why do men buy into this? Why are they willing to exploit women given the chance to do so? And I talk in the book about this dad that I call Dennis, who, he's kind of likes to think of himself as fairly progressive, but ends up making a whole lot of choices to sort of perpetuate gender inequalities in the context of his own relationship. And essentially what I find in the process through these interviews and through some of the surveys that we did as well is that in the context of things like our childcare crisis, when we don't have universal affordable childcare, and when we don't have gender pay, when we have gender pay gaps, when we don't have gender pay parity, what that means is that for many couples, it does make sense financially to have women be the ones to drop out of the paid workforce or to scale back their paid work hours when they're struggling to find childcare. And that's what happened with Dennis and his wife. He was working in IT and making triple what she was making as a social worker. And so it was, when they had kids, he kind of figured it makes more sense for her to stay home than for us to, for her to keep paying, as he talked about it, half of her paycheck, finding care. And so I wanted to understand kind of, what this means, though, is that men in these kinds of circumstances, this humor comes in part from the fact that they don't want to see themselves as bad guys. Men who are, relying disproportionately on the women around them, whether they have to do so for economic reasons or whether they could make different choices. They want to believe that they're, good men. They want to believe that they're good dads. They want to believe that they're good partners. And what this kind of humor, with this kind of sexist ideologies, things like what we heard with, Harrison Butker's, messaging around, women are just happier at home, or kids are just better off when moms are at home. That kind of messaging allows men to feel, like the super, like if mom is the super mom, they're the super dad in these kinds of situations by being able to earn enough money to allow moms to stay home or to, to make sure that she has the resources to do all the things around the house. And even some dads would see themselves as good guys for not doing the dishes because they knew they couldn't do it as well as their wives could. And so it's this way of justifying these kinds of inequalities and allowing them to see themselves as good men, even when they're exploiting the women around them. And oftentimes humor becomes this sort of soft outlet into those kinds of attitudes and a way to make that feel palatable, even when it has detrimental consequences for the women in their lives.
So what I think I hear you saying is that these men want to feel validated in their choices. And we talk a lot about how women want to feel validated in their choices, even women who are rejecting anybody else's version of how they're parenting. So what is your way to have more of these people in the various positions feel more validated that they are being the right kind of parent and partner?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we can think about there is what are the sort of disincentives to participation in a shared project of care? Like right now, I think one of the biggest barriers to that kind of participation is the ideal worker norms that we put onto men. That even in cases where men could be doing more at home, both culturally and economically, there's substantial pressure on them to be focusing as much of their energies as possible in the paid workforce, and that we don't really have the kinds of incentive structures with the absence of universal paid family leave, especially the kind of policies that many of our European allies have put in place with sort of, use it or lose it policies around, paid time off for men. And even things like limits on paid work hours, which places like France have, more meaningful limits than we do, that those kinds of policies, if put in place, would allow men, would kind of disincentivize the overinvestment in paid work, the kind of overwork that we know from research tends to exacerbate gender disparities and make it more likely that husbands and men partners more generally kind of have a disincentive to contribute to that shared project of care. So I think really, ironically, one of the strongest ways to increase gender egalitarianism to get men to reject these ideas is to build a stronger social safety net that would shift the incentives in ways that would, make more equal participation more possible. And, that's what the data, the time use data show in other countries. The places like France, you not only have women doing a smaller number of unpaid labor, a smaller amount of unpaid labor on an hourly basis than women in the US do, but men are also doing less too. And so it's actually the gender gaps are smaller. And so essentially it's that you're making everyone more equal and making everyone better off in the process of this. And the less, competition there is, the less there is to go around, the easier it is to participate more equitably and to support each other in that, as opposed to feeling like you have to, compete for what Dennis talked about as sort of like the perks of having a wife who stays home.
I think we sort of came full circle on that, and I'd love to sort of go back to you on that social safety net piece. Can you spell out for people how, or in listening, or anybody who's who's going to read your book or has read it, wants to hear it again, how that more robust social safety net is going to lead to some more of those gender equality norms that we just talked about today?
Yeah, and so essentially what the research shows on that front is that the more unequal societies are, the more people are likely to buy into the kinds of myths that make it seem as though we don't need a social safety net. And so it's sort of ironic, but
It is.
the kind, so essentially what research, like ideas about meritocracy, for example, and ideas about gender inequality are or kind of sexist attitudes are more prevalent in societies that don't have these kinds of stronger social safety nets. And research has shown that by putting those kinds of policies in place, you can shift people's attitudes because there's sort of less pressure to try to compete, to try to one up your neighbor, to try to one up your partner, even in the context of a relationship, when things are less precarious, when there's more social stability. And so this is a key part of the equation, is that we can change people's attitudes by changing the social safety net, and we can also change the structures in ways that make it possible for, there's plenty of men also who want to be doing more, but who are, logistically unable, in part because of the kinds of structures. This is particularly common for some of the lower income dads that we talk to, who during the pandemic, for example, had jobs that didn't allow them to work remotely. And so they wanted to be home. They wanted to be doing more with their partners to support the women in their lives more equitably, but it was, deeply challenging for them, and that simply wasn't an option given the kinds of job opportunities available to them. And they were, grateful in many cases that they kept their jobs and that they still had a job, to be able to do. But they understood that the deck was stacked against them in ways that, even if they wanted to, made it very difficult for them to be doing more of that work at home.
I'm going to take a few questions from the audience, and who have also given some great comments as well. One of them is that on some of these myths, which we're going to keep going with, that the debunking the meritocracy myth and the supermom myth can be complicated, but countering things that are central to people's faith or religion might even be harder. So in terms of effective ways you've seen for people to sort of change their minds about some of these long-held myths and understandings, what has actually been effective to doing so?
Yeah, I mean, changing people's minds is challenging, especially without that context of broader structural change, which can help people to see firsthand how a stronger net could benefit them in their lives. I argue in the book that one thing that we can potentially do on that front to get people to reject some of these myths, to get them to sort of see past these myths that have been promoted to try to dilute us and divide us in ways that, keep us from fighting for a stronger social safety net, is to help us see how one way that we are all connected is through a shared identity around care, that all of us at some point in our lives will both need care and probably give care as well. And so, we know that labor unions, one of the reasons that labor unions work as a tool for collective organizing is that they unite people around shared identities, but those identities are rooted in paid labor and paid work. And so what focusing on instead on our shared identities as part of a sort of network or kind of union of care is that we can see how stronger care related policies could actually benefit all of us, even, whether we are in the caregiver role or whether we are in the care recipient role at the same time. And I think helping to see those kinds of connections that care makes between us can help even those, those who are more privileged among us to see how our own ability to be engaged in paid work, to be engaged, to be able to care for our families oftentimes depends on the exploitation of the caregiving labor of others, whether that's oftentimes low income women, disproportionately women of color who are doing the work as childcare providers, as home health aides, as cleaners, as doing all of these other types of social service jobs that make our own paid work more possible. And so I think if we can sort of not use that as an opportunity to want to look away and to pretend that that's not happening, but instead say, okay, so how could a stronger social safety net help not only me to be able to get the care that I need, to be able to do the paid work that I want to do, but also help those who I depend on to be able to do that work, to make their work more sustainable, more possible in the long run as well. And so I think focusing on helping people to see their position in that shared network of care, to recognize how their own ability to do their work depends on the care of others, and to see how stronger policies could help us all to sort of make that net stronger, to make that net, the point is not to replace the informal networks of care or to, eliminate those kinds of outsourced care relationships, but to make the whole net stronger and to make those informal care relationships stronger as well.
Thank you. And your book's been out, I think, 2 weeks now, and I know you had that quote go viral about 4 years ago. So I wanted to ask you what the reaction's been like. I know you got a really positive write-up from my colleague Elliot Haskell in The Atlantic, who I think really captured a lot of the points you're making. But now that you have your ideas out in the world in this very succinct, beautifully written with many deep narratives in their book, what have you heard from people that has either surprised you or what hasn't surprised you?
Sure. I mean, I've been sort of overwhelmed in a good way by the positive response, which has been lovely. I mean, certainly, there's always haters on Twitter. Unfortunately, more of them today than there seemed to have been a few years ago. I don't check my DMs very often, I will say, in part because that tends to be where things like that show up. But I've been, for the overwhelming most part, thrilled to see this book resonating with so many people in so many different walks of life, and being able to see themselves in some of the stories that I share in the book, and also see others whose lives are very different from their own. And I think that gets back to this idea of, in order to have a sense of linked fate around care, in order to see how care affects all of our lives in these sort of webbed ways, it helps to be able to see deeply into the lives of other people. And I think that's part of what I try to do with the qualitative stories that I share in the book, is to really show a window into lives of people, like Patricia, who are trying to navigate this kind of system and who are struggling against its constraints, who are, pushed into low wage work, who are struggling with unpaid care responsibilities, as a way to help, make visible those challenges that it's easy to overlook when we're pushed to focus so narrowly on the context of our own lives.
I'm going to take another question from the audience about some of the changing demographics that millennials and Generation Z might have different ideas about the way gender norms should be and work-life balance. And we do have some, polling data and regular data that show that they have very different expectations of what the workplace and family life will look like than previous generations. I wonder if you see these groups as being some of the driving change behind government and workplace policy, and if so, what that could look like.
Sure. I think that's definitely true for women, for young women in society today. I have more questions and concerns about young men. So Ipsos does a poll every year around International Women's Day that looks at sort of men's attitudes around gender, around feminism, around sort of sexism more generally. And the data for the last couple of years have been troubling, in the sense that young men, kind of Gen Z and kind of younger millennial men, seem to be going in sort of the opposite direction of their older peers, in the sense of more of them are saying that feminism has pulled us in the wrong direction, that it's gone so far as to hurt men, that we're seeing kind of substantial numbers of young men saying that that it kind of buying into these kinds of sexist attitudes. And I think part of that stems from the fact that we are living in an increasingly precarious economic society, in the sense that your ability to live a good life, to have a good life, very much depends on making it to the top of the economic ladder. And so especially for young men who kind of haven't made it yet in that system, it can feel particularly detrimental to have to be, competing against women, maybe in a way that their, older generations of men didn't feel that they had to, particularly with the kinds of economic pressures that they're facing. And so I'm a little bit concerned about what that might mean going forward if we don't try to take steps to push back against some of the cultural messaging, sort of, the Andrew Tates of the world, that are promoting this kind of oftentimes deeply sexist and misogynistic messaging, oftentimes explicitly targeted at young boys and young men, to get them to buy into this idea that, women are just naturally better suited for caregiving, that men are just naturally better suited for power, in ways that I think are helping to kind of maintain this status quo. And so I think there's a lot of work to still be done on that front. But I do have some hope about at least the willingness to question the sort of centrality of paid work to our identity. That is, I think, a place where we'd have seen some shifting on those fronts. Though at the same time, I think we've also seen, changing attitudes around things like parenthood. Some of that stems from, the lingering attachments that we have to paid work, driven by our precarious, oftentimes, economy that leads people to feel like maybe I have to give up on the dream of having kids if that's the only way that I can potentially have a shot at having a stable future career-wise.
Well, you talk about that economic precarity as part of your supermom myth as well. That was one reason these parents feel the obligation to parent so intensively and with such force is because they are aware that this generation is the first one to be likely to make less money than their parents and have more economic insecurity. And that's a really scary thing as a parent. I mean, we know that living in economic precarious times in our country leads to a lot of really detrimental outcomes. So this sort of comes back again, full circle against the social safety net, and again, what that might look like. So how could a robust social safety net break that narrative in half?
Yeah, I mean, I think on that front, I mean, it is very easy for even relatively privileged parents today, and this was kind of links back to some of my, pre-pandemic research on kind of families and privilege in schools, and the role that privileged families are often playing and try to opportunity hoard for their own children. I think this comes from the fact that we have this precarity, we have this social inequality where, when the rungs of the social ladder are so far apart, it can feel very scary, even for your kid to go from the top rung to the second rung, or from the second rung to the third rung, because there's such huge gaps between them. And even if your kid will probably be fine, it can feel like a scary change, and it can feel threatening in ways that can lead parents to try to, use and muster whatever privilege they have to maintain their kid's spot on that economic ladder. And so I think that, the more that we can think about how could a social safety net help to essentially, I think I'm mixing metaphors here, but like compress that space on the ladder. So make it so that those spaces, that there's not so much of a difference between, where being a little bit higher up and a little bit lower down, that the less inequality there is, the less incentive there is to try to opportunity hoard, to try to get that sort of leg up advantage. If you know that, whether you're a little bit higher or a little bit lower, you'll probably be fine, and that you'll have that kind of strong, sturdy social safety net to fall back on, that the chance of falling, extremely far is much lower in the process as well. And so I think that's a place where, a stronger social safety net can help to reduce some of those anxieties that we know modern parents, even relatively privileged and even relatively progressive leaning parents, are often willing to lean into, and are willing to say, like, I'm going to make this decision for the benefit of my own kid because nobody else is looking out for my kids. So why shouldn't I for those opportunities? Why shouldn't I do whatever I can to help my own kid get ahead, even if that ends up making the whole system more unequal in the process too?
Yes, you talk about that with April in your book, about how she really felt the need to sort of look down on anybody who she thought was lower on the ladder than her. And so have you seen in other countries where they have more social safety nets, less of that opportunity? We call it opportunity hoarding is the term you use, Taryn. You maybe define that as well for people, what you mean by that.
Yeah. I mean, so opportunity hoarding is essentially the idea of making decisions for your children that will try to maximize their own individual advantages, rather than trying to say, what would be best for the system as a whole. And so in my earlier research, some of the things that I looked at were how essentially affluent white parents would coach their children to ask for help, ask for accommodations, ask for attention in the classroom as ways to help them sort of get a leg up over their peers, and to get more of the attention in the classroom, in ways that kids from, less privileged backgrounds often were being discouraged from doing so, in part because of how they might be judged for asking for help, or judged for trying to, navigate around, navigate those kinds of systems. And I have some work on things like, asking for exceptions from rules, that middle and upper middle class white parents were often helping their kids get out of rules around homework, get out of rules around attendance, get out of rules around, classroom behavior, in ways that other parents were not successfully able to, in part because our school systems are designed to cater to the interests of those privileged parents, because of how they depend on, the test scores, and also the donations and the volunteer hours of those more privileged parents. And so opportunity hoarding is about sort of how parents, particularly those in relatively privileged positions, can leverage those resources, kind of parallel to what we talked about with the sort of, financial elites who can buy influence over the political system. It's a similar kind of process that often happens when it comes to, buying houses in the quote unquote best neighborhoods, or sending your kids to the quote unquote best schools, or helping your kids to be the ones who, get into the gifted program, even if they maybe don't make the cut test score wise. And these are the kinds of things that can help to perpetuate inequalities in our system by ensuring that the opportunities in our society disproportionately accumulate to those kids who are already relatively privileged, and help to kind of perpetuate that as well. And I feel like there's another part to your question that I may be missing now.
No, I asked you what opportunity hoarding was. I think I talked about how the social safety net could sort of be some of this solution that you're talking about, and how that would look. Like, why, if you, for instance, if you knew that if your kid could have a job that maybe was in a construction but still have health insurance, maybe you'd be less concerned about them getting into the best four-year college. Like, the idea that we have a very narrow path in this country of what success looks like, and that comes with economic security, and that is tied into everything from being able to have a roof over your head to be able to see the doctor and not go bankrupt.
Yeah, and certainly, I mean, we are not the only country where this kind of opportunity hoarding happens. But at the same time, and I haven't seen any explicit internet, like in cross-national comparisons of the prevalence of this kind of opportunity hoarding, which would be a fascinating study for someone who wants to do it. But certainly, I think there is reason to suspect that parents in the U.S. Are taking steps, at least compared to some other places. There's other places where this plays out somewhat differently. Like in parts of East Asia, this often shows up in things like what's been called shadow education, like hiring tutors, hiring, sending kids to intensive after school programs to boost their academic successes. So this is happening elsewhere, but it's often happening in places that are, highly unequal societies where there is a very big split between the people at the top of the socioeconomic spectrum and the people at the bottom, in part because, in that kind of highly unequal system and what often causes that high level of inequality is the lack of a social safety net, that's what helps to drive up to make it more possible for the people at the top to hoard more wealth, and to take more resources and exploit more from those at the bottom. That kind of inequality promotes this kind of opportunity hoarding by essentially attaching a bigger advantage to maintaining a spot at the top of the ladder, relative to places where things are more equal overall.
That is really interesting. And I have a question from the audience that ties into Alyssa Strauss's book, When You Care, which talks a lot about how men and boys can really benefit from having more caregiving responsibilities. And someone asked, why hasn't our current climate made more men feel they need to spending more time with their kids? Because as we are seeing more men and young men, more boys and young men adrift. And in Alyssa Strauss's book, she talks about how men who had a stronger caregiving connection to people had lower risks of suicide. And that really surprised me because we know that can be a completely separate epidemic, but the idea that caregiving can really be a grounding force and do good, not just for the person you're caring for, but for yourself. And this was a really interesting reframing. So I'm wondering, kind of back to you, what you think of how, either why the current climate hasn't done enough of that so far, or what do you think it could do to change that going forward?
Yeah, I think that's a terrific point, and I think it gets at this idea that care does have. I mean, it's care is economically devalued in our society, but care work does have, a high intrinsic value, and that's not to say that other forms of paid work don't have high levels of intrinsic value. You can love your job as a software engineer. You can love your job as, doing all kinds of being as a plumber. But this kind of care work often does come with strong kind of emotional attachments and the rewards that can be transmitted through that. And that often gets used as a way to justify not paying the people who do that work very highly, and as a way to say, like, oh, well, it has these intrinsic benefits, so we don't need to pay the women who do this work as highly because they're getting so much out of it as childcare providers or as home health aides. Exactly.
The
There's this
hobby.
perception that because you love your work, you shouldn't be paid well to do it. And so I think that's part of it, is that we financially devalue this work, that even if it would be emotionally valued for women, for men to be able to do that and sort of psychologically beneficial, it's stigmatized because of its low economic value. And this, I think, gets back to that sort of ideal worker norms that we put on men, and the way that we stigmatize men if they're not focusing all of their energies on paid work. But I think it does raise important questions about, especially if we're talking about, mental health crises, especially if we're talking about, the toll that this is taking on women. If we can find ways of helping to sell men on the potential benefits of this, that there are psychological benefits, and there are also, benefits for their families, for their relationships, both with their children and with their partners. The quality of men's participation in this kind of labor is one of the strongest predictors of, relationship satisfaction for couples and longevity. And so it's a way to, invest in the future of your relationship, with your kids and your partner, by doing that kind of work as well.
There's 2 points I want to add on that. One is that I've done a lot of writing on paid leave, and with paternity leave, the people who stand to benefit the most from paternity leave are working women. That they really, both women who were, connected to the spouse, and women at the office who were then felt less penalized for being able to take their own time off. And also this concept of changing this narrative. I want to pull from an audience question here, that if more men did feel more of that pain, would we get to the policy and systemic changes faster, do you think?
That's a good question. I think potentially, and certainly in the context of the research that we were doing. So we were following couples from pregnancy, oftentimes through the first couple of years postpartum, and for many of them, this was their first pregnancy, and it was pretty consistent. And this is consistent with larger scale survey data as well. That the dads who were able to stay home, who were able to be more involved early on, oftentimes, did see more easily the kinds of challenges that their partners were up against, and were, willing to make those sacrifices, willing to fight harder for these kinds of social safety net policies, not across the board, but in general. And it was, if anything, the flip side was even more true, that the dads who weren't home during those early stages, who didn't have access to paid leave, who didn't have access to time off, were oftentimes relatively aloof to the challenges that their wives were facing, particularly during the pandemic, when they were struggling to suddenly do both their paid work and also, oftentimes be the primary caregivers for kids at home. And I mean, this was at the same time, I think we have to be careful about rushing into it without attention to the other kind of counter pressures. One of the most troubling findings that came out of our pandemic data with our national surveys, we asked parents, how often are you yelling at your kids? That was one of the questions that we asked during the pandemic. And essentially, college educated white dads were kind of off the charts compared to everybody else. And that had to do with the fact that they were the dads who were disproportionately able to do at least some of their paid work from home. But unlike moms who were in that same situation, they often, this is from our interviews, they often had relatively little experience, doing both simultaneously before the pandemic, being a paid worker full time while also
the dads, the college dads, really.
Yeah, the dads, that those dads were able to work from home during the pandemic, but they didn't have a lot of experience being both the childcare provider and the paid worker simultaneously. And in some cases, moms, I talked to one mom, for example, who was in that situation. She was able to do all of her work remotely, and her husband was able to do some of his work remotely. But she said, he's just yelling at the kids all day. He's just angry at them, and it's just making it miserable for all of us. She actually told him to go back to the office and said, just stop working from home. It's not worth it to have you here. And this, it's not that she was doing much better herself. She talked about how she gained 40 pounds in 3 months. She was drinking more heavily. She'd gone back on antidepressants, but she still felt like she was in a better place emotionally to keep her kids safe, to protect them from the kind of angry wrath of their dad than he was in terms of keeping emotions in check. And so I think we also have to be careful about, telling men to do more without changing the structures around them in ways that, affect the kinds of pressures that they face.
That is fascinating. I remember that example well. Was that Dennis? Same Dennis who was
no, this was Russell, I think. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I want to be mindful of your time, and I want to ask you, your ethnographic study, is it over?
At least for now. I mean, I think I certainly would be interested in going back. I've changed institutions since then. So I was at Indiana University before, and I'm now at the University of Wisconsin. And just physically moving my family and changing institutions made it hard to keep things going in the short term. But I would certainly be interested in following back up with these same families down the line to see how things have played out, particularly in the wake of recent policy changes and as we move forward with potential future change.
And do you have any idea what might be next for you with either with that or with a different study?
There's
different where you want to go next with all this information you put out in the world?
Sure. There's a lot of data that I still have to deal with from the project as a whole. I have a couple of projects that I'm working on, a few around evangelical mothering that kind of came out of the project, and kind of the decision, the role of religion in kind of perpetuating some of these ideas, kind of digging into that in more depth. I maybe at some point want to get back to that original idea that I had around sort of the best laid plans of parenting that I thought about writing this book about originally. And then lots of the pandemic data that we still have left to kind of grapple with in terms of things like vaccine decision making and school decisions during the pandemic, and screen time decisions that families were grappling with in those contexts. So some things on that front. I think going forward, I'm really interested in how this present moment that we're in, whether that's the pandemic and the sort of cultural attacks on things like public schooling around things like CRT and panic around transgender kids, how that seems to be reshaping trust between families and schools, and potentially kind of bridging some of the work that I've been doing over these past couple of years with looking at the social safety net and its impact on families, with thinking about kind of circling back to education and thinking about what are the repercussions of this moment for schools and for particularly our trust in public institutions of education going forward.
That sounds like a really natural extension of your safety net piece to go to public institutions more widely. I hope you get to do that. And we've got one moment left. Is there anything you want to say? What should people take away from this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I think my hope Yeah, I think my hope here is that people will come away both that sociology I see as a force for ungaslighting, in the sense that it can help readers and people more generally to see that, if you're struggling, it's oftentimes it's not you, it's society, and that being able to sort of see beneath the curtain in that way. And my hope is that the readers will be able to see that through this book, and also better be able to understand the challenges that they face and see each other in the process in ways that can help us to overcome some of those myths that are intended to delude and divide us in ways that, are at least attempting to persuade us that we can get by without this social safety net that we all really desperately need and deserve.
Okay, well, I want to thank Jessica Calarco so much for sharing her time today, and I want to thank Eve Brodsky and CareForce, including Jen Yunker and Catherine Goldstein, for making this happen. And a big thank you to New America's events team, including Carly and Tamia, who I have not met, but I will look forward to meeting. And anybody else who still wants the book, it is Holding It Together, How Women Became America's Safety Net. There should be an option to purchase it on the screen, but I think anywhere else you can get it at most bookstores at this point, I imagine, correct?
I think so. Yeah. Thank you so much, Rebecca. And thanks to Eve and to New America and to the CareForce, and to Better Life Lab for putting this all together, and to you all for being here. It's been a pleasure to chat with you all today.
All right. Thank you guys so much. Have a great rest of the day.